There is open source reporting that Chinese companies are providing surveillance equipment to that mercenary group, the Wagner group, fighting in Ukraine. Does the U.S. consider this to be providing military support to Russia?
We've been watching this very closely. To date, we have seen Chinese companies, and of course in China there's really no distinction between private companies and the state. We have seen them provide non-lethal support to Russia for use in Ukraine. The concern that we have now is based on information we have that they're considering providing lethal support. And we've made very clear to them that that would cause a serious problem for us and in our relationship.
Lethal support, what would that entail? What do you think?
Yeah, I imagine it's only escalating. Boris Ryvkin is here. He's the founder of Montefly Holdings, LLC. He's a former Ted Cruz National Security Advisor. Boris, how are you, sir?
Doing great. Thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Great for your insight. So we mentioned in the opening, President Xi possibly heading over to Russia, is the current U.S. ambassador to the UN, saying that if they send lethal support, that would be a red line, so we're drawing red lines. Former ambassador to China saying that if they send lethal aid, then we need a worldwide response. I'm not loving red lines and world responses to what seems like an escalation. What do you make of all this?
I have a somewhat different take, Mike, on what's going on. I think that the Chinese are becoming increasingly fed up with Putin's underperformance. I think that they are exacerbated by the fact that this is going on, that this is grinding on. You have to remember that the Chinese were not really keen on Putin invading in the first place. In fact, Putin had wanted to invade as early as the fall of 2021. Some estimates were maybe even as early as October. And the Chinese were a major restraint in trying to get him to postpone that attack plan. And part of it was tied to the Beijing Olympics, which happened, of course, early in 2022. And so Putin accepted Xi's sort of pleas on that and pushed the invasion date back a little bit. And on top of that, Putin and his main advisor on his Security Council, Nikolai Patrushev, who's sort of the second man in the Kremlin, really, as far as the power structure, went to Beijing and told Xi and his advisors that this would all be over in a week. So literally what everybody was predicting in Western intelligence, the media, how quickly, Kiev would be taken in 96 hours, those kinds of very optimistic estimates. That's what Putin and the Russians were communicating to the Chinese. And it was on that basis that Xi begrudgingly let Putin kind of gave him the green light and went along with this. So he thought that this would be over very quickly. And of course, now it's 1 year on. The Russian army has suffered devastating casualties. It's massively underperformed. It's looking more like a quagmire, war of attrition type of stalemate scenario that could go on for years, potentially. And the Chinese are not at all happy with this. On top of that, Putin periodically raises the specter of using WMD or nuclear weapons, even in a tactical sense. And there have been a number of credible reports that the Chinese have been a huge restraining force in trying to prevent him from doing it. Because they're the last.
So what does China want?
So I think that
go
ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. What does China want in the future?
Right. So originally, China went along with this because of how quickly they thought it was going to happen. Now, Putin has been weakened. The Russian army has been bloodied pretty badly. So the Chinese don't want a situation where Russia is in chaos and Putin is ousted or there's some kind of political instability and collapse in Moscow. So they want a weakened, far more dependent Russia than it already is on China. And the relationship between Russia and China is really one where Russia is subordinate to China. It's effectively a resource depot for the Chinese and going to become more so. There's a huge demographic imbalance. The Russian economy is very uncompetitive and basically sells the Chinese discounted gas, discounted timber, discounted base metals, and all sorts of other raw materials. It's not an even-handed relationship. And there are millions of Chinese migrant workers in the Russian Far East. And in fact, in joint military exercises that the Russian army has with the Chinese army, the PLA, the most recent exercises, the Russian army was training in a subordinate role to the Chinese, being led by Chinese officers during those exercises.
Wow.
So that just emphasizes, brings home the point as to how subordinate Russia is here. And it's becoming even more reliant. And Putin even changed Russia's borders quite some time ago to accommodate the Chinese, to cede some Russian territory to the Chinese. So that's their relationship.
So it sounds like China would like an even weaker Russia. So do you think that would lead them to provide some lethal aid and then further draw some battle lines around the world?
Yeah, I think their goal is to sort of shake the stalemate up and to tie the lethal aid with their own peace plan to try to put the kibosh on the conflict as quickly as possible. I think that they're really trying to drive toward freezing this over and pushing towards some sort of a ceasefire because they're becoming exacerbated with how badly Putin has been performing and how this is grinding on, because they don't want this to spill over beyond where it's currently concentrated in Ukraine, and they certainly don't want any kind of great escalation. So that's why.
Okay, interesting.
Right. So it's a bit.
Are we currently in a Cold War with China? It's a big question. If so, how do you think it could turn hot?
The answer is, I think, to me, unambiguously yes, and we have been for a number of years now. It didn't start with the last administration. It's been going on really, if you might even say, since the early 2000s, I think. Some would argue since the 2008 financial crisis, when the Chinese kind of lost faith in our way of doing things with the financial collapse. But I think the answer is unquestionably yes, with Xi at the helm. I think that he's far more ideological, far more political. I think that he operates with a view that time is not on his side and not on China's side. He's a man in a hurry. And you're seeing that with what's happening in India, with border clashes that have led to people being killed. You're seeing that with his destruction of one country, two systems in Hong Kong, 25 years ahead of when it was supposed to expire under the agreement with Britain. You're seeing that with the escalation around Taiwan and the saber rattling there, and with the very aggressive militarization of the South China Sea and the East China Sea, which sadly we've allowed them to move ahead toward. Obama famously said, I don't want to waste my time on some shoals and atolls in the South China Sea. I'm going to be doubling down on Afghanistan instead. Well, we saw how that worked out for us. And now turning around and wondering, those atolls and shoals have now become artificial island formations that have Chinese bases on them, And the South China Sea accounts for about a third of global shipping. 80% of shipping in the world is done by sea, by, container ship. So, it's kind of a problem that the Chinese might be in a position to interfere with our ability to access those trade routes. So it would have been nice if we'd been a bit more active there for the past 10 years and instead of blowing it off. So I think...
Okay, so there's a big question, because do you think China, and I agree with you on they're maybe more desperate, or at least time's not on their side, and that's not good for us. So, but do you think they're going to keep kind of like tightening the crucible in different economic ways? Or do you think China would be okay with it, or would ever want it to actually turn into missiles flying or boots on ground?
I think for now they're going to be focused more on indirect, asymmetric economic ways than I think they're not going to do anything until they're just going to do it. Like, I don't think there's going to be any kind of warning on the part of, there's not going to be a big buildup like you had with Russia and Ukraine. I think they're just going to go ahead and what it is that they're doing. Like in the case of India, they just went ahead and clashed with Indian troops on the border and just said, this border area belongs to China. It doesn't belong to India. Get out to the Indians. So, that's the kind of thing we're going to be seeing. I think they're not yet at the point of being able to do that. And I think with Ukraine, Xi's view is he can't afford to lose. He can't afford to make the mistakes that Putin made. So to the extent that he's going to be doing anything more kinetic, as they would say here in DC speak, he wants it to be, kind of like Luke in the first, Star Wars movie. It has to, hit the bullseye because the consequences politically would be disastrous. But in the meantime, while we're focusing and understandably, like you said, on the chance of this escalating into a hot war, I think we need to take into account how much we've already ceded and how behind we are already in the other war. And I like to I just mentioned the South China Sea. That's bad enough. We have whole regions of the world, Central Asia, Africa, Southern Africa, that we basically ceded to the Chinese. The been doing in the Middle East. We left Afghanistan. The Chinese have flooded Afghanistan with investors scrounging for rare earth metals. I mean, the Chinese already have a corner on that market when it comes to rare earths, and they want to build those supply chains even further. So these are the sorts of things we haven't really been thinking through. And I think while it's very important for us, and I keep emphasizing this with others who've talked about this, to focus on Taiwan, the risks there, Japan, focus on, like I said, India, focus on other things that the Chinese are doing militarily. I think it's very important not to lose track of and keep our eye off that economic commercial trade ball. And it's not just the trade deals, like with the Trump administration negotiating with them and whatever. I think we need to do a lot more of getting involved in intervening economically from an investment standpoint in these regions of the world that were abandoned to China. Dump the ideology often, and just to kind of close that point, often what we've done is to come to these countries like in Central Asia and Africa and say, we'll invest in your country, we'll finance some of your infrastructure development and the rest, but you have to reform structurally. You need to adopt all these liberal democratic reforms. You need to do this with your government. You need to do that with your government. The Chinese come in and say, here's $2 billion, and here are the roads and the bridges and the tunnels, the hard infrastructure we're going to be building for you at a loss. And we're going to import them, we're going to train your unskilled workers. We're just going to take care of everything and build the bridges and the tunnels. But we don't care about what government structure you have. In fact, whatever just works for us, provides security. That's the model.
But their influence then grows indirectly there. Boris, we got to run. Tons more to talk about here. I'm grateful for the time already. Let's absolutely do it again. Montefly Holdings, LLC, former Ted Cruz National Security Advisor. Boris, grateful. Thank you, sir.
Thanks so much, Mike.
Hey, thanks for watching that clip. I'm starting to get very concerned about World War III and the steps that are, the alignments that are happening right now around the world. I don't care for it at all. So to learn more about where we're headed, you can download the First TV app, watch this special for free, also available on thefirsttv.com. We need to be aware of this. We need to be ahead of this. While the rest of the country is going to sleepwalk into World War III, we will not.